Hello, this is Rebecca, the Community Storytelling Advocate at the National Center for Transgender Equality. It is Tuesday, March 14th, and we are recording this webinar on connecting with local media. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Jay Wu, who is our Media Relations Manager. Jay, can you introduce yourself?
I'm the Media Relations Manager here at NCTE. Not exactly here since I'm working from home today because we had a little bit of snow last night. Basically, that means that I'm one of the main liaisons between between journalists who are writing about trans issues and spokespeople from NCTE. I also give journalists information, for example, if they're not super knowledgeable about trans issues. And I work with Rebecca to connect storytellers all around the nation to.
Great. And what we're hoping to do today is to give y'all some tools for how you can pitch your own stories and how you can connect with media on your own. NCTE absolutely wants to help with this, and we are not trying to throw you to the wolves, but we also want to make sure we can't be everywhere. We aren't everywhere. We want to make sure that if there's stuff going on in your community, you're able to reach out on your own. So a brief rundown of our agenda. We're going to look first at how to pitch out. Then we're going to look a little bit at writing op-eds and letters to the editor, as well as some resources. And I'm going to send follow-up emails with some of these resources, thinking about how to train media on trans topics, as well as some other broad things to consider, and then ideas on putting that all into practice. As a reminder, and some of you who've participated in webinars with me before know, we are encouraging you to speak on your own behalf. So right now, NCTE does not have a speakers bureau or a volunteer network or regional offices, so you are not an NCTE representative. That's something we're always looking at and thinking about how to work best on, and if you have any questions or thoughts, please let us know. And because I am a giant ham, here is a joke in the fine, or about fine print, and there is a joke in the fine print. And if anyone's on the phone and not watching the video, they are just going to have to wonder what those jokes were. I promise you they're mediocre at best. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is a little bit of how to pitch. And this is relatively simple, so I don't want you to overthink it. Broadly, you're going to come up with an idea, you're going to refine that into a pitch, pick who you're going to submit that pitch to, do the actual pitching, and then if necessary, you're going to follow up. And the first thing is just having that idea. And this can really be just about anything. It can be an upcoming event, it can be something that's happened either in your community or nationally that you feel like you have a perspective on, or it can be your own story and your own experience. And Jay, any thoughts on what might be happening in a community that would be an upcoming event or something that might be newsworthy?
Yeah, so an upcoming event might be something like a name and gender change clinic that's happening in your community. Sorry, my cat is here. Something like a name and gender change clinic that's happening in your community. You know, it could be the first one or it could be one of many, but that could be a great way to get your story and some other people's stories told. A newsworthy story might be, for example, some kind of legislation that's happening, or, you know, your community is thinking about passing a non-discrimination ordinance, something like that.
And then when thinking about your own experiences, you can think about activities that you participate in. Are there hobbies that you do? Have you experienced a specific unfortunate discrimination or awesome support? And the idea is taking your story or your community or an event and trying to make it bigger. So not bigger in terms of out of proportion, but trying to think about how your story is connecting with broader things that are happening that news organizations want to write about. So Jay and I came up with sort of a fictional idea of how to walk this through, and we're going to go through step by step. So the first thing, have an idea. So we've made up this transgender concert pianist who's having a recital next month and is thinking that might be interesting to a reporter. So again, the first thing you're doing about pitching is you're coming up with, okay, well, what is the story that I'm pitching? And then you're going to think about refining your pitch. And this is taking that broad idea, I'm a trans concert pianist, I have a recital coming up, and narrowing it down a little bit. So some things to think about with that. First, how is this interesting? How is this something different than what other people might have heard? How is this a new story? Also thinking about what else is happening in the news. And Jay, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, on the most basic level, if something really, really newsworthy is happening, you probably want to wait a little while to pick your story. For example, around the presidential election, that was not an easy time for anyone who wasn't doing presidential politics to pitch out stories. But, also if you're working in your community, if there's some kind of big event happening in your community, or a series of big events, you might want to wait a little while, particularly if you're this concert pianist, you're giving this recital next month. You don't need to pitch the story right this week. You could maybe wait a week or two. Or you could start getting in touch with a reporter, but with the knowledge that they might tell you, hey, I'm really swamped this week, but maybe another time.
And you can always run things by myself or by Jay to think about, okay, is this pitch interesting? And is there other stuff going on in the news that we might be aware of that would either make it a really good time to pitch or a time to say, well, I would actually suggest waiting a little while. And then a last...
Right. So, yeah. Sorry, just something I wanted to add. I only talked about other things happening in terms of when not to pitch, but being aware of what else is happening can also be really useful to you. So, for example, if your state is considering some kind of legislation that's related to trans issues, you can tie that in with your own story, even if you're a concert pianist.
And then the last thing to think about, flattery never hurts. If you know that you're pitching to either a news outlet or to a specific reporter who's done good work in the past, you can definitely include that in, I was really impressed with this piece you did about transgender identity, or I've really seen the way that you talk about our community. Flattery never hurts. So you're coming up with this initial pitch, and first you're just going to write out all of your thoughts. So I'm going to read this because I don't know if, I think there's some people on the phone who may not be able to see the slides. My name is Morgan Smith, and I'm a concert pianist from Springfield. I'm giving a recital at the Springfield Concert Hall next month. I've been playing the piano for 20 years. I'm also transgender. Becoming a successful performing artist hasn't always been easy, but music is universal, and playing the piano makes me feel great. So there's some things in here that I'm going to highlight that you could potentially pull out. So this is this sort of initial text that you might email to Jay and I, or you might share with friends. And then you're going to think about, okay, what are the really key points? So who are you? What is the newsworthy thing? So in this case, there's a concert coming up. Time is always helpful. So thinking about, is this new or old? Is this a month or 20 years? And then connecting that to transgender identity, as well as to a more universal theme. So this is both talking about how this this made-up person, Morgan, is transgender, and the idea that music is universal. Any thoughts on this, Jay, before we sort of look at how this can be refined?
Nope, go on.
All right. So if we're thinking about that, the first thing we want to do is think about how we're going to introduce this pitch. And this is something really similar to those of you who have done the storytelling workshop. It's the idea of from the very beginning at the introduction, you're going to say who you are, what you're doing, and you're going to try and define some of that language. So Morgan is giving a recital next month, and that's notable because Morgan is a transgender classical pianist. And then Morgan's going to expand on that a little bit, talking about the story that this reporter might be interested in. So the classical world is tricky for transgender people, talking about a little bit of discrimination, and then talking about overcoming that to say, I'm in my 20th year of being a professional musician and things have never been better. And then finishing off that pitch with the very specific ask. Would you be interested in writing a profile on my journey and or covering my concert on April 15th? I'd be happy to put aside a pair of complimentary tickets for you. So you're helping suggest what that story might be, and you're refining it in a way that's going to make it very clear what you're asking, what you think the story might be, and if that person needs something, if they need tickets, if they need a pass, if they need the date or time, you're trying to make it as easy for them as possible. Anything else that people should be mindful around pitches, Jay?
Well, just to go back to the flattery point, so the best way to put that is in the beginning. And, you know, obviously this is just sort of your basic pitch, but in an email you would send to a reporter, you would say, you know, Dear Joe, I recently read your piece on, you know, on this concert pianist whom I really admire, and I thought you did a great job on the profile, and then go on to say, my name is Morgan, etc. So that's kind of the first thing they see, and then they're kind of primed to feel good about what you're saying to them.
So you've written this pitch, you've maybe run it by me or run it by Jay and we've helped you tweak it, or you've run it by some friends and they've, yeah, this is really interesting. So then you're going to think about, okay, how am I going to choose who I'm pitching to? And steps 2 and 3 here of refining your pitch and choosing your targets really overlap, because once you've picked your targets, as Jay just said, you're going to tweak that pitch specifically for that target, whether it's about a reporter who you've liked their work in the past, or whether it's making a specific tie to as the entertainment writer, or as a writer on local news, or as someone who has written about transgender identity again in the past. So you really want to come up with this initial sort of draft of your pitch, and then as you're picking your targets, you're going to refine that. So how do you pick your targets? And Jay, I'm going to hand a little bit of this over to you because you have more experience with this, but in general, you're going to be thinking first about, well, who broadly are your targets? Are you thinking about radio, TV, print, new media, online? And that's going to inform how you're reaching out and what that's going to mean. So Jay, can you talk a little bit about how this might work?
Sure thing. So, you know, in general, a lot of reporters are responsive to picking up the phone and just calling them, but sometimes, especially when it comes to new media, websites like BuzzFeed, for example, those people who write for those sites tend to be a little bit more responsive over email. And also for print reporters, email can be helpful as a first step, and then you can follow up with a phone call. Or you can make an initial phone call and say, okay, I'm going to follow up with an email with more information there. When you're pitching to radio or TV, you mostly want to go over the phone because they work on a tighter schedule. And again, they may ask you to follow up with an email, and you should definitely have that ready to send off. But, you know, picking up the phone can also help you get a direct contact instead of just emailing, you know, info@whatevernetwork.com.
And that's a really good tying into, there's going to be variations in staffing from outlet to outlet. So in some particularly smaller papers, you might be emailing the editor-in-chief. In some, you might be emailing the local news beat or a features editor or someone who's writing specifically on entertainment or someone who's writing specifically on education or someone who's writing on healthcare policy. And Google is really going to help you here to figure out who the best person to pitch to is and what they've written about in the past. So Jay, can you talk a little bit about the difference in pitching to different size organizations?
Sure thing. So, you know, if you live in a small community and you have a community paper, that's often the kind of paper that'll be run by just a few people, maybe just even one person. And obviously that kind of publication is the easiest kind to get published in. You know, if you live in a small town, maybe you're even friends with the person who runs the community paper, maybe you went to high school with them or something, and it'll be very easy to land your story in there. But not very many people are going to see it. You know, the word is going to get out to a couple more people who wouldn't have known about your concert, but the people in your community might already have heard about it because they know you and they know people who know you and they know that you are a famous concert pianist who lives in their community. So the next step up would be a local paper, which is, you know, a paper sometimes in a smaller city that isn't, you know, the biggest city in the state that has a major paper. And obviously this varies from state to state depending on population. Some states have multiple major papers. But in other states, it's more common for there to be one big state paper that people kind of look to as the paper for that state. and then there are smaller papers that are a little more significant than a community paper, but that still don't have a huge distribution. And those are going to be kind of moderate level. So, that paper might have a more fully fleshed out staff. They'll have multiple sections, and you might be able to reach out to a specific reporter who's even written on trans issues before, which you can do, like Rebecca said, by Googling. Or if you can't find anyone who fits that description, you can go, and this is helpful for any paper, you can go to their masthead, which is the listing of all of the staff on the newspaper, and find the person whose job title most fits what you're pitching. So in the case of our concert pianist, you might want to look for the arts editor if there is an arts section. And then if we're looking for, yep.
One of the things that I have a question about, Jay, is if I'm going to the masthead and I don't see an obvious choice, so there isn't like a transgender entertainment writer, should I email everyone or should I try and still just pick one or two?
You should just pick one person at first, and they will, if it's not what they cover, they'll say, hey, this sounds really interesting, but this is actually not my area of expertise. I recommend that you reach out to my colleague, whoever. And if you're not sure, you can say somewhere in your email, I'm not sure if you're the right person to reach out to. I'm also happy to help folks sort through who the right person might be to reach out to in those situations.
So one of the things that sometimes we do when we're really excited is we're excited about getting our story out, we're excited about sharing it, and so we might want to have this inclination to email every person we possibly can, and that can be counterproductive because it can, first, it's clear, staff talk to each other, so it's clear when you've emailed everyone, and second, that can just detract from feeling like you really are targeting and are more just trying to do scattershot.
Yeah, that's right. Like we said about the Flattery thing earlier, especially if you're reaching out to a reporter and not the editor for the entire section, when you email them, they're like, oh, like you know your stuff and you picked me for a particular reason. And that can go a long way.
How does pitching to papers differ from pitching to local or regional radio and TV?
So like I said before, radio and TV sort of work on a shorter schedule. So if you're pitching to a paper, they might say, hey, this is interesting, but I'm going to look to cover this in a couple of weeks. And that reporter has a chance of actually coming back to you in a couple of weeks. And of course, it's good practice for you to follow up personally. But my experience with radio and TV especially, has been that if you call them up and say, hey, like this event is happening in 2 weeks, they'll be like, great, call us back in a week and a half, because that's when we're going to be setting our schedule for April 15th or whenever.
And do you think that individuals are able to really pitch to national radio and TV, or is that something that working through NCTE or working through trying to get more local or small or moderate coverage is going to be more successful?
I think that generally pitching to any larger outlet is going to be more difficult. I think that if as just a community member from Springfield, pick your choice of 15 states, you are going to have a very low chance of, for example, landing an appearance on an NPR show. It's possible, anything is possible, but you would have, it's even difficult for NCTE to get placement on outlets like that. So that is going to be pretty difficult. Similarly to getting placed in a national paper or even the major state paper in your state, because those publications are a lot more focused on sort of looking at the big picture and less on, hey, what's happening in these small communities. If your story is really, really compelling, you do have a chance, of course, but getting help from NCT is also a way to go about that.
And then we also want to make sure that we're remembering to at least acknowledge new media. So this is usually what internet media or podcasts. And those are things that we are still not sure quite how to gauge those in terms of like, is a story in your local paper going to be more or less impactful than a story on a podcast or a story on BuzzFeed? And I don't think any of us have crystal clear answers on that, but to say that definitely keep new media in mind, that as you're thinking about where to pitch, places like BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or podcasts that you listen to or Slate or Vox or any of these, Vice or any of these other sort of newer media companies, a lot of which have one-syllable names, is something to keep in mind and is something that can be part of your larger list if you're thinking about pitching out.
Yeah, and something else I would say quickly about that is that, if you've been pitching your story out and you're having some trouble having people accept it, another thing you can do is just publish. Like Becca mentioned, Huffington Post. Huffington Post does allow for contributors. You can use a site like Medium, which will give your story some legitimacy, even though it's not in an outlet or like a reporter's not writing about it. So that's slightly different.
Balancing wanting to offer support without wanting to promise more than we can deliver, we are always happy to try to help look at pieces. Sometimes when there is particularly pressing stuff going on at NCTE, we might not be able to, but you are always welcomed and encouraged to email us, and at the very least we'll try and find some resources, and hopefully, depending on time, we'll try and give you some suggestions or editing advice. Again, we might not always be able to do that, but we will always try and connect you with resources. So you have this awesome pitch, you've thought about where you want to pitch it, and now you're trying to find that actual contact info for how to pitch it. And the first thing is web searches are always your friend. So that's going to be, Googling the editors or Googling Pitch Desk or Googling News Desk or whatever it is. In particular, there's a website that I'll send out later. I'm going to mention it here. That's the U.S. National, I actually don't remember what the PL stands for, but they have a ton of different subsections on their website that have lists of newspapers and lists of TV stations and lists of radio stations. And it's a really great way to start and see what exists in your state and in your community. And from there, you can go through old articles, you can look at what reporters have their contact info out, and you can sort of get a sense of what exists there and what you can reach out to. Any other thoughts on picking targets, Jay?
One thing is that some reporters, particularly if they work for bigger outlets and are concerned about getting way too much email all the time, their contact information might be very, very hard to find. And, there are a number of tricks for figuring that out, but if there's a reporter you really, really, really want to pitch and it's high and low and you can't find their contact information, feel free to shoot me an email, and I have access to a database that will hopefully be able to provide that information.
And the question that we would ask if you are going to reach out to us for things like that is to just be very specific of why you want to target that particular reporter. So it's also helpful to think a little bit about new media. Again, we said there's web searches, and there's just a ton of sites out there these days. Vox, Slate, Medium, and HuffPo, Politico, BuzzFeed. There's also local new media sites. So there's Patch, which does a lot of locally focused content. So there's a Washington, D.C. patch and even some neighborhood patches. There's Chicago patch. There's other things. So that might also be worth seeing if some of the larger papers in your area or larger media companies like USA Today's network or that sort of thing have local pages that might be interested in either smaller stories or in self-reported stories. All right. You've gotten your idea. You've refined it. You've picked who you're going to pitch out to. So now how do you actually do that pitching? And there's a ton of resources on this online, and we're also happy to help with that actual framing of what a pitch document can look like. And one of the ways to do this is to look at press releases. It is totally okay if you do not have a press release, but a press release is a simple and built-in format that can be a helpful checklist to make sure you have everything you need. So for stuff, if you're Googling how to write a press release, and we're going to have some resources for this for you as well, it's just a helpful checklist to say like, okay, the date, who it's from, who it's to, all of the important points. Are there any links? Are there any costs? Are there any time information that they need? And even if you're not doing a formal press release, which I don't think you need to, it can be helpful to look at press releases that other organizations or that other people have done to get a sense of, okay, this is the stuff that reporters are going to need to be able to make a decision on whether or not they want to run with this piece. Any thoughts on that, Jay, or any stuff to add?
I would just say that if you're reaching out to reporters individually, which you probably should be, like sending them personal emails, it is more than okay to not have a press release. Press releases are easiest when you're sending out sort of mass emails, but it is actually more effective to have an individualized message for individual reporters. And, you know, if you do go through the trouble of putting together your own press release, that's awesome, but if you do that and you send it to an individual reporter, make sure to add a personalized note at the top.
That makes a lot of sense. So some other things to think about with pitching your piece. Generally, it can be helpful to initially pitch, particularly if it's for something that's time sensitive. So it's, I have a concert on April 15th, at least 2 weeks out, to give reporters enough time to see if this is a story that they have the capacity to do and if it's going to fit in with their other things. And then you can follow up at around 48 hours before as just sort of a reminder and a final nudge if you haven't heard from them. Any other thoughts, Jay, on when to pitch pieces?
Like we said before, if you're talking about TV, you can pitch maybe a week in advance, but they might say, call us back later. And you know, this can differ from station to station, so they will let you know. And also this differs from reporter to reporter, outlet to outlet. Some reporters are a lot more scatterbrained, and if you pitch them 2 weeks out, they might say, wow, gosh, sounds great, and then completely forget about it. So it's always good to follow up. And, you know, if they emailed you back, you probably have their phone number, and it is definitely okay to follow up over the phone.
And then the last thing I'm thinking about is a little bit about that follow-up. So thinking about, you can follow up via phone or email, only follow up once or twice and then move on. It doesn't mean you can still pitch that reporter again for a future story, but it doesn't mean that you should email the same reporter once a week, every week, bothering them. So it's that balance of, you definitely want to make sure that you stay on someone's radar, but you don't want to overwhelm them. And then it's also really awesome to be able to provide resources even if they can't do the story in that moment. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next section of, a reporter might say, I'm really interested in covering transgender topics. I can't make it to this concert. Or I don't have the time to write about this story right now. And then you can follow up and thank them for their interest and send some of the resources that we're going to talk about in a moment, so that even if they aren't able to work with you on this story, they're remembering you hopefully as someone who's helpful. And the last thing, don't be discouraged. So having done a lot of pitching in my own life outside of NCTE, and certainly, Jay, you can speak to experience of working with NCTE, it can be really frustrating to feel like you have an amazing story, you know it's something, or you think it's something that people are going to be interested in, and reporters just aren't picking up on it. And that is very much can be a it's not you, it's them type of situation. Reporters these days are trying to juggle more and more responsibilities with fewer and fewer resources. So absolutely this type of pitching is important and valuable, and we want it to turn into stories. But even when it doesn't, that doesn't mean that it was something you did wrong.
Definitely. I mean, anyone who does this professionally will tell you that their ratio of refusals to acceptances is very high. So like, people will say no to you more than they say yes. And unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And I would think about it more as, it's not a bad thing if they say no, it's just a good thing if they say yes.
And I actually love, this wasn't about pitching for news stories, this was about submitting pieces for publication. There was someone who did a piece going around a while back that was saying, rather than thinking I want to get 5 yeses, saying I want to get 100 no's. Because if I'm getting 100 no's, hopefully there will be some yeses in there, whereas I don't know when those yeses are going to come. I can only control how much I submit. I can't control what people do with it. So any questions before we move on a little to writing op-eds and letters to the editor? And I'm going to make sure that people are able to unmute themselves. You can also type in the text box, and if not, we'll move on in just a second. All right. So when thinking about op-eds and letters to the editor, it's first helpful to clarify what we mean by that, because there's definitely some overlap in what they are, but we wanted to sort of give a rundown of how people generally talk about op-eds and letters to the editor, or LTE. So an op-ed is going to be a little bit longer, usually around 400 to 500 words. Sometimes organizations or news outlets might even have a limit of 750 words, occasionally 1,000. 400 to 500 is a safe range to shoot for, and you can double check with that paper if they take stuff that's longer. And the idea of an op-ed is it's an opinion piece, and it's something giving commentary and a new perspective. It might be related to a specific article. It's definitely related to something going on in the news, even if it's more broadly transgender rights or student rights or healthcare access. It doesn't need to be to a specific news headline, but it should broadly tie into something that the paper is going to be talking about anyway. And op-eds often are a little bit more lead time. So it's sometimes days, maybe even weeks in advance of, this is something we're working on, this is something that the paper's interested in, and this is something we're going to try and place. Letters to the editor are shorter and they are more succinct. So it's 150 words or less. Rarely, but double check, they might give you 200 words, but for the most part it's going to be 100 or 150 words. And it's going to be a response to something in the paper. So it's something that's being submitted within maybe a couple days, sometimes even hours. So if a newspaper ran an article and you want just like 3 sentences to respond, that's a letter to the editor. If something is going on in culture or in society and you want 500 to 700 words to talk about it, that's more of an op-ed. Any other thoughts on the differences there, Jay?
No, I think you've covered all of it. I would just add that, Rebecca said that an op-ed, it's, sorry, the word is not coming into my head. It's preferable for an op-ed to have something to do with, stuff that's going on in culture, something that, the paper's already been talking about. And that's a really good guideline. So I just want to stress that, like, you can write an op-ed about anything. I remember when I was in high school, we all had to, write an op-ed as an assignment, and someone wrote an entire piece about why broccoli is terrible. That is not something that's likely to get picked up by any paper, but you can try. But it's really helpful when you're writing to the editor, who's gonna read the op-ed and consider it for publication, if you can say, hey, I saw your recent coverage about transgender issues and wanted to offer my take.
And something that I'm realizing we didn't clarify, and this is version 1.0 of the slide deck, so I'm making some notes for tweaks. When you're pitching something, you are sharing a little bit of your story in that pitch, and you're saying, I am hoping that the newspaper or the website or the TV station will do a story on this. When you're submitting an op-ed or a letter to the editor, you are submitting something for publication. So the pitch document, they're going to use and they're going to think about, but they're not actually going to publish it. The op-ed or the letter to the editor, you're writing something that is hopefully ready for them to publish, maybe with some tweaks, but it should be in shape that's publication ready. And that's something that I think we could tweak this to clarify a little in future versions of this. There are tons and tons of guides out there on how to write op-eds and letters to the editor. So we're going to give a little bit of information, but not go too in-depth. So first, NCTE has an op-ed guide that I'll be sending as a follow-up to this if y'all haven't seen it already. And then there's an awesome website called the Op-Ed Project, which is at theopedproject.org. And they have a lot of great resources, sort of going step by step with tons of examples. And beyond that, if you Google how to write an op-ed or how to write a letter to the editor, there are going to be a lot of resources out there. And I would also encourage you to look at where you want to submit. So if you know, I really want this in my local paper, take a week or two or go back a week or two on their website and look at what other op-eds they're publishing and what type of tone they take, how long they are, and that doesn't guarantee that they're only going to take that type of thing, but it can give you a helpful sense of what that paper is comfortable publishing. To submit op-eds, that's going to be paper to paper. In general, there may be an opinions editor, and the newspaper may give you some information on how to pitch op-eds. If not, you're welcome to ask us to see if you missed something, or you can email their general editor. For letters to the editor, the newspaper should always be clear on how to pitch, because this is something that just about any paper is going to have space for, and it's something that they know their readers want, so they should be really clear on how to pitch those. Any questions on op-eds or letters to the editor before we move on to how to help media do better on trans topics? So in thinking about training media, the two sort of sections that we're thinking, or the two sort of ways we're thinking about doing that, are responding to things that they've done, and then more broadly trying to reach out and build relationships with reporters. If you're responding to things that they've done, that's great. We want you to provide feedback, and we want you to do it politely. In particular, it can be really helpful to both offer some amount of praise and critique. So it's really wonderful that you're covering transgender topics. I was disappointed to see XYZ. Or I'm really glad that healthcare is an important issue on your radar. I was hoping you could have given this information. So you want to make sure that you're giving feedback on how to do better, but also reporters are human and they like hearing validation just like everyone else. In terms of how, you can always call or email, and then you can even use Twitter as a way to get a little bit more of a visibility boosting. And talking to organizations or to reporters on public Facebook pages or Twitter pages can be a really great way to engage. For all of this, again, you want to think about how it's going to reflect on you and how it's going to reflect on the transgender community. So you want to be careful when you're providing feedback to, if they deserve criticism, absolutely give that criticism, but don't do it in such a way that's going to reflect negatively on you or reflect negatively on transgender rights. Any thoughts on that, on how to respond to articles, Jay?
Yeah, I just wanted to put a sort of heavy point on being cautious about responding in public. You've all seen tweets or Facebook posts that have gone viral. Just be really, really careful about how you respond to a reporter in public. If you think they deserve to be chewed out, and you think they deserve to be chewed out publicly, definitely go ahead and do that, but make sure that it doesn't backfire and end up making you come off badly. Unfortunately, when we're talking about populations like the trans community, which a lot of people still see as something, like outside their experience, it could be very easy for them to say, oh, look, like this transgender person or this person who's supporting transgender rights is just, is responding in this way.
Fair, and that's totally, that is unfair that we are being held to those standards, but we want you to be mindful of that.
Exactly.
You can also proactively educate, and what we mean by this is rather than waiting for them to do something wrong, you can find ways to share resources or to think about things initially. So part of this is, and this is something we also talk a lot about in the storytelling workshop, define your terms in submissions and interviews. So when you're, and this is something that I actually want to redo for the next version of this slide deck, is that when you're submitting something or when you're being interviewed or when you're talking to a reporter, you can slip in definitions and explanations throughout. So you can say, well, as a transgender woman, and that means, or as a member of the transgender community, which means, or as someone who's experienced discrimination, which can look like. So you're really making sure that every opportunity you have to connect with this media outlet, you're doing some education work with them. GLAAD also has a really great media guide that you can find at their website. You can find by Googling GLAAD Transgender Media Guide, and it gives some advice both on definitions as well as some specific advice for reporters on how to talk about pronouns, how to talk about names, how to talk about experience, that sort of thing. And then you're always encouraged to speak more with those reporters or connect with other resources. So you can definitely say, here's my response, here are some thoughts on this specific article. Let me know if you'd like to talk further or if you'd like to be connected with some more resources. So you're not starting with a book-length email that's dozens of paragraphs long. Instead, you're starting with something that's a little more short and to the point and offering room for more. Any other things there, Jay?
No, sounds right to me.
Some other things to consider, and these are things that we want you to be mindful of when you're building a pitch out, when you're deciding who to pitch out to, when you're writing op-eds or letters to the editor. Some things to think about. Are you ready for publicity? And this is a question that only you can answer. If this story gets picked up, how is it going to impact you? How is it going to impact your family? If this is a story about a transgender child, how is it going to impact that child? And thinking about, do I want my boss to see this story? Do I want my spouse to see this story? Do I want my coworkers to see this story? And again, there's no right or wrong answer there, but we want you to think about it before it happens. Similarly, definitely going through social media settings and making sure that when someone looks at your social media page and isn't friends with you or even is friends with you, that they see what you want them to see. And that if you need to go back and take photos down or go back and rethink your social media page, you should do that before you're doing any of this submitting. The last thing I want you to think about is your support network. And again, support before, during, and after any sort of publicity happens. So thinking about, if I get a really great story about my experience, who am I going to celebrate with? And if I get a story that doesn't turn out the way I want to because we don't get to control how reporters cover things, how am I going to feel about that and who can I reach out to? Any other thoughts on things to consider, Jay?
No, I don't think so.
So for putting it into practice, we want to encourage you to do all of this. We want to encourage you to think about how you can pitch your own experiences or stories in your life or events in your town or news that's coming out and pitch it as it relates to you. And then we really want you to always think about writing op-eds and letters to the editor. I'm going to be sending out some resources around that in the next week or so because we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of HB2 in North Carolina. And this is something that no matter where in the country you are, is a newsworthy event that you can use as an opportunity to share your story and to pitch that out. Other things for putting it in practice, if you haven't already connected with me about being in our list of community spokespeople, please do so. And that's the idea that if and when we get reporter inquiries saying, I want to talk to a trans person in Atlanta, or I want to talk to the parent of a trans child, or I want to talk to a trans veteran, that the community spokespeople are the people we reach out to first. It never requires you to participate, but it means you'd be first on our list when we try to connect with people. Any other thoughts either from Jay or from any of our participants on other ways that y'all can put this stuff into practice?
I don't have any, but I'd love to hear from any of the participants.
All right, we've had a quiet group today. So if there are no other thoughts or comments, we will end it there. And I'm going to follow up with everyone via email with the video of this slideshow presentation, the slide deck itself, and some of the resources that we talked about in the slide deck. Please do follow up with me or Jay if you have any specific questions or thoughts, either in general or about this presentation specifically. As we said, we're always working on improving it, and we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and we'll be following up soon. So thank you all, and have a